I want to make 4 quick points and not be accused of being the long-winded, rambling academic. First, I'd like to just briefly introduce myself and my work. Then I'd like to talk about the rites of passage that young people go through when they enter the world of work. I want to talk briefly about the challenge of remoteness in places like regional South Australia, and then I want to talk about some of the ways that we can address this challenge of remoteness. And so overall, I'd like to focus on the role of migration in getting careers established and the implications of that for regional development. We've heard such interesting case studies from these 3 organisations that before I address this theme, I'd just like to briefly introduce my own organisation and the work we're doing. I'm the director of something called the Hugo Centre for Migration and Population Research at the University of Adelaide. And the Hugo Centre is named after the late Professor Graham Hugo, one of Australia's most prominent demographers. And the Centre's work is about understanding and managing the global challenges of population change. Our research focuses on 4 interlinked themes of research. The first is migration, diasporas and diversity. We're trying to understand how dramatic rises in mobility, social difference and cross-border connectedness are changing the life of cities, of regions and of nations. A second theme is about demographic change in the life course. We want to know how population shifts such as ageing change the nature of work, of family life and government policy. A third strand we're working on is population-environment interactions. How do population processes interact with changes in our environment, in our physical environment? And then a final strand of research that we're doing is about the social applications of geographical information systems. In this stream, we want to understand how we can describe and explain population change using state-of-the-art spatial analysis through geographical information systems. So we do this research in close cooperation with government, industry and community groups in order to help inform and improve decision-making. So if you have knotty problems around migration population dynamics, in your area, we would welcome the opportunity to work with you and engage. Since I'm a relatively recent migrant myself, it would be presumptuous of me to talk too much about local migration and population dynamics, which I'm still trying to get my head around. But since the topic is getting careers started, I wanted to talk in general terms about the importance of rites of passage that young people go through as they transition from the world of youth to the world of work. As a university academic, I have to spend a lot of time around young people at the start of their careers in the 18 to 24 age group. And when I ask my classes what they intend to do after graduation, what do you think the most common answer is? I'll tell you. In 2006, my colleague Dr. Diane Rudd conducted a study of about 500 students at the University of Adelaide, where she simply asked them if they planned to leave South Australia after finishing their studies, and only a quarter of them said no. More than 40% said yes, and 33% said they didn't know. Many of them will end up leaving by default. And this is by no means an unusual set of results. Researchers have shown very reliably that the relationship between age and migration is bimodal. That is, there's 2 peaks in the life course at which people tend to be more mobile. One is at the age of retirement, when people look for better weather and a slower pace of life. As you know, South Australia is one of the places many of these folk come to. But the other, and by far the biggest spike in mobility, is at the point of entering the labour force. And this is partly because moving is a rite of passage, a very important one. It's a period in which people are leaving one phase of life and entering another. Making a physical separation often helps to cement that change in identity. It's not just about leaving the parental home, it's often about leaving the comforting network of friends and family and local community and proving that you can make your own way alone in the world. And this period of mobility isn't just about indulgent self-exploration, it's also about building careers. By travelling, young people are able to experiment, to make mistakes, to move on, to recreate themselves. They learn new ways of doing things that can make them more productive and more useful to their communities. In countries like Australia, New Zealand and Canada, all built on immigration, this rite of passage through migration is especially important for the career. I often think that in these countries, in order to succeed, you need your BA, you need your MA, and you need your OE, your overseas experience. And there's a layer in almost every organisation that's only accessible to people who have global experience and skills, partly because people with this experience can extend the reach of organisations. They have broader horizons. They can see opportunities and threats that others don't necessarily perceive. So my point is, in general, we should try to embrace this culture of migration amongst young people, rather than trying to prevent them from leaving, which is unrealistic anyway. We should encourage them to take risks. We should encourage them to learn from their mistakes and recognise that young people moving, being mobile, is always going to happen, and that it's good for them and it's good for all of us. The second thing I wanted to talk about, though, is what it's like to be left behind. It would be disingenuous, I think, to say that everybody always benefits when people migrate. Regions of origin often draw the short straw. They often lose their best and their brightest, a brain drain, and they sometimes experience an overall loss of workforce, a brawn drain, if you like, so that even unskilled primary and manufacturing jobs go unfilled. Because migrants tend to be younger, as I've just said, regions of origin can experience population ageing, which in the long term presents some challenges to economic growth. And remote rural areas suffer especially from these kinds of challenges for two main reasons. The first is a lack of accessibility to services. People in remote rural areas lack the same quality and quantity of healthcare, education, transportation infrastructure, policing, banking, shopping and entertainment services as people in urban areas. And in addition, rural areas often lack the kinds of glamorous work and lifestyle that young people now associate with living in a first world country. So even though, broadly speaking, the migration of young people is good for individuals and good for economies and societies, we need to be aware of these costs for their regions of origins. And the question is, how can we make sure that the benefits of migration are shared with these regions? And this is the challenge of remoteness. And now that more than half the global population is living in cities, it's one that's increasingly faced by non-metropolitan areas around the world, including in South Australia. So a very important problem or challenge to address. And I want to briefly review three options that respond to the challenge of outmigration of young people from rural areas. And I'm drawing here on work done by the Hugo Centre in 2013 on migration and regional development. And I'd specifically like to acknowledge the work of the late Graham Hugo, Dr. Helen Barry and Dr. George Tan in this work. And I want to identify these three options for responding to outmigration from rural areas. One option is international replacement migration. Young native workers are often unwilling to do dirty, difficult or dangerous jobs like meat processing, aged care and construction work. But on the upside, international migrants are often more than willing to do those jobs, and that's one reason we're seeing an increase in international migration to regional areas. And I think this is something that policy can continue to encourage. I think it's about providing the right support for smooth integration into local communities, and part of that is about combating some of the negative stereotypes around migration that exist. Migrants, for example, net contributors to the fiscal purse, not detractors. They don't steal jobs, they take the jobs that other people don't want to do, and as we saw in the case of Jack Chen, they frequently create jobs as well. So that's one option for responding to the challenge of outmigration from rural regions, international replacement migration. Second option is return migration, regional relocation. So when people start to reach their 30s and 40s, they begin to enter another phase of life. They go through another rite of passage. Just as the bright lights of the cities attracted youths away from the regions in their 20s, a quieter lifestyle, non-metropolitan areas begins to attract them as they begin to settle down and form families. People in this age group tend to have developed the skills and experience that can make a transformative contribution to regional development, but they're also in high demand from multiple regions. To compete for them, regions need to provide well-paid jobs, they need to provide good housing, and particularly they need to provide excellent education options for the families of people in this age group. So there's an obvious role for government here, which of course needs to be focused in areas that have real economic growth potential to try and attract these people in the young families age group. There's another option for responding to outmigration from regional areas. The third option is what I call engaging the diaspora. And this option focuses, rather than on trying to influence people's movements, it tries to influence their connections. In a period where much of the global economy is online, location matters a bit less than it did in the past, and connection matters a lot more. So when young people leave, they may settle in places where they have access to ideas, to new technologies, to expertise, to investment capital, to decision makers and opinion shapers who can make a real difference to development in regional areas. They can be positive connectors, they can be change agents and influencers on behalf of their hometowns, for example. I was recently at the ASEAN anniversary summit for business leaders, and one of the examples that was given there was of one scientific discovery that had been made in agriculture that had transformed a whole agricultural industry by making it more productive. So you can see that by being connected to centres of excellence where new technology and ideas are generated, and by being able to transfer them to their home country, their hometowns, young people who are migrating out can make a substantial difference. And by remaining in touch with them, keeping in the loop about local opportunities, non-metropolitan areas can leverage those connections, and again, there can be a role for government there in maintaining the kind of alumni network, if you like, of the local hometown and the local region. So just briefly to summarise, for many young people, starting a career means moving away from home, and often a long way away from home. There's nothing new in this. Migration's always been a rite of passage between youth and adulthood, and it involves the development of maturity and specialised skills that can make people more productive and useful to their communities. I don't think we should be trying to curtail migration of young people at the outset of their careers, but we do need to be mindful of the potential downsides to non-metropolitan areas in terms of brain drain, brawn drain, and population ageing. And as I've said, there are at least three ways we can harness migration in order to compensate for some of these losses. One is through replacement migration, where international migrants replace young people who are unwilling to do the kinds of jobs that are on offer in these regions. Another is through internal relocation, particularly targeted at attracting young families into areas with strong economic growth potential by providing the education options for their kids, the housing and the career options that they find attractive. And then a final way for compensating for this start of career out migration, I think, is to engage with those who have left. Try and keep them in the loop about local opportunities, leverage their access to decision makers and opinion shapers in centres of excellence and economic growth outside the region so that they can make a difference for their hometowns. And I'll finish there. Thanks very much.